Okay, so Deuteronomy. I forgot to write down the Hebrew name for the book, but the name Deuteronomy, it means second law, and that's because the book of Deuteronomy, what it does is it's Moses telling the law again, and I'll kind of track through some stuff to bring us to the point of the beginnings of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy. So let's remember back. To really set up Deuteronomy, we have to remember way back again, and we've done this several times. We have to remember back to Abraham, actually, to understand Deuteronomy really well. And the central thing with Abraham was the promise to Abraham for the land covenant. Again, what was it? Israel, Abraham and Israel, I'm going to give you the promised land. Okay? We've held that promise, that covenant, we've held that kind of in place all this time, and we've been watching Israel kind of get closer and get closer to actually receiving the land promise. They're going to be a great nation, and they've got to have land. And from that place in the land, then they will then be a blessing to all the nations. That's the goal. That's the goal. But we hadn't got there yet. And so we entered Exodus, and Abraham, his family became a great nation. And then they left Egypt, and then we hit Numbers. And Numbers was basically the wilderness wanderings. And there was a generation in Numbers that disqualified themselves from inheriting the promises of God. And we wanted to feel the weightiness of that last week. That they rebelled against God so much so that they disqualified themselves from receiving the promises of God. Like that's heavy. That's heavy. And so after the Balaam and Balak with the prophet Balaam, after that whole situation, now we pretty much have a whole new generation that is prepared in the book of Numbers to go into the promised land. And so they're on the footstep. It's time. Like, we're ready. We're ready to finally do this thing. And Joshua, Moses isn't going to lead them in because even he disqualified himself. But Joshua is about to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. Like, we're there. We're at that moment. But before they go in, Moses has some final words that he wants to say to this new generation that's going to go in. And that's the book of Deuteronomy. It's the book of Deuteronomy. So they're about to be led in by Joshua. Deuteronomy, in a lot of ways, is a reestablishment, or even in some ways, a renewal of the covenant with this new generation. So we talked about Exodus 19 through 24, 25-ish. That's the Sinai covenant. That's where they're at Sinai. God is now making a covenant with the nation, way back in Exodus. And Moses is just taking that and now giving it to the new generation, saying, now you are going to take this covenant. You guys have all grown up now. You're ready to go. You're going to take this covenant now, and you're going to be the people that steward this thing. And so that's what's happening in Deuteronomy. And so we're going to see a lot of covenant stuff. It's not going to be terribly explicit because we're just going to kind of cruise through some things. But this is the basis of the book of Deuteronomy, is reestablishing this covenant. And it's a second law. It's a second law. So it's a reiteration of the law of God that we've had up to this point. That's Deuteronomy. Once they enter the land, though, things are going to be a little bit different. So really, it makes sense. They've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and dealing with all that. But now they're about to go into a land where they're going to really settle in to be a nation. And so things have to be different. So Deuteronomy actually takes some of the instructions and laws in a slightly different direction, just because they're in a new location now. So it's some changes there. And because they're in the new land, among other things that's going to be different, they're also going to be interacting with other nations. So if you're just wandering around out in the wilderness, there's not a lot of, you might run into the Moabites and commit some idolatry there once or twice, like we saw. But there's just not a lot of people out in the desert. But now they're entering into the land flowing with milk and honey, and there's other nations that they're going to be interacting with. And God's like, I got to prepare you guys for this because, as we've seen, they're kind of a stick-necked people, and they want to go after other gods. And so he has to kind of set them up for that. So we see some of that in the book of Deuteronomy. And I meant to say this on the front end, if you were to ask me what my favorite book of the Bible is, among the top ones, maybe among the top three, maybe the top one would be Deuteronomy. And you might think that's strange, but what Deuteronomy is for us is it becomes the prototype for the rest of the prophets. So the rest of the prophetic literature throughout the Old Testament, it models itself in significant ways around the book of Deuteronomy. And so what the prophets do is they do what Deuteronomy does. It looks backwards, as we'll see. It looks backwards to the past. And it gives oracles about what the future is going to be like. And it does those two things to inform the present generation. And the prophets are doing that very same thing in very similar ways to the book of Deuteronomy. So much so that when you get into the histories, so like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, there's a modern theory that those are like in exact alignment with Deuteronomy tradition and history. So basically, those books give us a perspective on history that is influenced by the book of Deuteronomy. So for instance, the book of Kings. If you'll notice, the book of Kings is like, and this king did good, and this king did not do good. And that's the whole thing. It just goes through like and lists them. It might show a few examples here and there, but that's the book of Kings. And what it's doing is it's saying this king was faithful to the covenant, and he did good. But this king was not faithful to the covenant, and he did bad. And this king, he didn't do good to the covenant either. And that's what Deuteronomy is doing. It's showing us, we're actually going to look at a chapter that is all about the kings that will come. And so the rest of the histories are just saying, did they walk in the law of God and faithfulness to the covenant like Deuteronomy talked about? So the Deuteronomy tradition affects the rest of it. It's that significant. It also, the book of Deuteronomy, is the foundation for the study of the end times, or the last things, eschatology. So believe it or not, if you want to understand eschatology, the study of last things, the book of Deuteronomy is where you start. So it's a significant book, and I'm gonna show you a few places where what I've talked about just now appears. So I think that's my introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. Scroll down. That's a significant kind of verse there, but we're going to get to it anyway, that Deuteronomy 4, 6 through 8. But open up that file that I have attached here. I scanned it into our notes. And if you'll look at the very top, that little ABCXCBA, this is the book of Deuteronomy laid out in front of us. We talked about what a chiastic structure, where you have a center point that is the most significant, and out from it you have parallel sections. So you have the X in the middle, then you have a C and a C, a B, B, and A, and they mirror each other. What's interesting about the book of Deuteronomy is its chiastic structure makes the shape of like a menorah candle. You guys know what a menorah is? It's the candlestick with the 6 like branches out. So you can kind of see the shape. There's the X in the middle, which would be like the center candle, and then it makes the little budding out things. And the menorah is like a symbol for Israel. Like the Star of David is kind of a modern symbol for Israel, but the menorah used to be the symbol for the people of Israel. And it's kind of cool, the menorah shape there. I don't know if that's how it was meant to be. Kind of seems like it might be, because this structure, it's pretty obvious as you work through it. So notice what we see here. We have an opening section. Moses looks backwards. And then down at the very bottom, closing section, Moses looks forward. The B and the B, you have a opening prophetic sermon, closing prophetic sermon. You have 2 covenant sections. We're going to only deal with one today. And then right in the center, you have the law code, or the statutes and stipulations. And all that section is there's like some preparation before you get to that portion, and then some stuff afterwards. But that section is Moses' retelling of the law to the people to reestablish them in the commandments of the covenant. And when I say the word covenant faithfulness, what that means is you are faithful to the things that you agreed to in the covenant. So for God to be covenantly faithful, He will bless this people. He will bring them into the land. He'll also discipline them if they're disobedient. For them to be covenant faithful is for them to keep the Ten Commandments, to watch after the poor and the widow and the orphan, amongst quite a few other things that they're to do as the people of Israel, as part of their covenant faithfulness. So it's faithfulness to that law code, that section there, and the stuff that we've already interacted with. So what we're going to do, we're going to work through the first ABC and as much of the X as we can that's of the important stuff. And then next week, we're going to pick up and we're going to close this thing out. And I'm excited because it really sets us up for the rest of the Bible, whether we get to it or not. So, all right, I just want us to look at, you see that screenshot that I gave you? It's Deuteronomy chapter 4. So, John, you'll know where to turn. Deuteronomy chapter 4, but you can just look at it, at that screenshot. As difficult as this may seem for me to be able to do, I'm going to try to just kind of open this up and just teach through it, because I didn't make any notes on it. So, the first section of this, which is verse 1 through 4, is basically just kind of the intro to the law codes that he's going to be talking about. So this section again is, let me make sure I got that right. This section is the opening prophetic sermon. So Moses is now doing primarily reflections backwards, but he's also just kind of introducing the section that we're going to be moving into, and he's talking about the commandments and covenant with God. So that's kind of that first part. And in there, verse 2, he says, "You shall not add to the words which I am commanding you, nor take away from them." So don't add or take away from this stuff. Verse 5 kind of starts the next section. And I want to read through this, and I'm going to talk about it just a little bit. So verse 5, "I have taught you the statutes and judgments, just as the Lord commanded me, that you should do thus in the land where you are entering to possess. So keep and do them, for this is your wisdom." This law is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the peoples who will hear the statutes. And all the people around them are going to say, when they see the statutes and the laws that they're keeping, "Surely this great nation is wise and is a wise and understanding people." For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call on Him? So what they're saying here is, Israel, when you go into the land and you follow this Torah, the other nations around you are going to look on the way that you're following this, and they're going to say, "Surely this is a wise nation." In other words, you, Israel, you have a role of instructing the other nations in the ways of the Lord. That is their calling when they get into the land. And the other nations are supposed to look at the way you steward the law of God and say, "This is a wise and understanding nation." And this becomes like ingrained into the calling of Israel, is to be a light to the nations by living out the ways of God and influencing the other nations. Also it says in verse 7, is there a nation that, like, what nation has a God so near to it as we do? So they're reflecting on the ways of Yahweh and saying, He's just as the Torah is so significant, so Yahweh is so significant. One thing I wanted to highlight here, and if we only get through this chapter, it's enough, because this is such a significant chapter. I wanted to highlight here the difference between the law of God, the Torah, and the rest of some of the ancient laws that you would get in the ancient world. So everybody say ancient Near East. Ancient Near East. So the ancient Near East would just be the area we call maybe the Middle East now, back in ancient days. So it's not the Far East, it's the Near East. So believe it or not, we can actually go and we have other what's called law codes or laws that other nations had from the ancient Near East, way back when. And we can compare them. And we can look at them and say, well, this is what that nation's laws were like, and here's what the Torah was like. And we notice some things. The significance of the law of God is it really stands out from the other laws in a lot of ways. For instance, its care for the poor, the marginalized, and the foreigner is a significant feature of the Torah that some of the other law codes didn't have. So, like, one of the sections that we'll get to, if we have time, is every 7 years, we've talked about this, you are to release, or what is it? Yeah, actually, I think it is every 7 years. I've been back and forth. Every 7 years, you are to release the debts. If someone owes you a debt, it may be 7 or it may be 50. Every 7 years or 50 years, you're to release the debts of everybody who owes you a debt. Like, they're free. And in that way, what's it doing? It's going after the issue of poverty in the nation. Slavery. Sometimes people had to actually sell themselves into slavery. Well, they could only be held as a slave for 7 years, and then they had to be released. And not only that, but you had to give them money when they left so that they could start their life back. It's very significant. Other law codes, it had the higher class, they could kill somebody and not get in trouble for it. This held the higher class of people to a high standard. They were going to be judged harshly. So God's laws, they're very wise. They're very distinct. And that's what they're supposed to be stewarding in the land, and it's supposed to affect the peoples around them. Now imagine if they had done that perfectly, like they had been called to. How that would have affected the nations out beyond them. Cool. All right, so the next one, next section in here you can look is verse 10. I won't go into this much because it's just basically him saying, remember the days that you stood before the Lord at Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people. And all this is doing is just him saying, remember back to when you stood at the foot of Sinai, you entered into covenant. That's all this section is saying. He declared his covenant to you, which he commanded. That's that section. Verse 15 opens up the next section. I won't read it verbatim, but basically he says here, when the Lord descended on the mountain, you didn't see a figure. You didn't see an animal. You didn't see a person standing there. There wasn't something that you could see. And so don't go and start making replicas of God, try to represent Yahweh by worshiping the sun or making a statue like you did before. That's not how we worship Yahweh. We don't worship Yahweh by building a statue to him. Now, all the other nations, they do that. And so look at verse 19 here. Beware not to lift up your eyes to the heavens and to the sun and moon and stars and all the hosts of the heaven. Don't be drawn away and worship them and serve them, those which the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heavens. So he's saying, when you look up at the stars and you think those are gods, there may be divine beings out there, but we already talked about this. The Lord allotted those divine beings to the other nations. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the furnace from Egypt to be a people of his own possession. Or it could also, I think, be translated, maybe not here, but a precious treasure. A treasure to the Lord. So this is just that section. God saying, I have called Israel to be my own possession. My inheritance is Israel. So the other divine beings, they have their nation, but this is God's nation. And he's reminding them of that as part of this covenant. So that's that section. Very significant there, because it informs us that there are actually other beings that the nations have been handed over to, as we've talked about. The next section is, I think, the most significant. So go to the next picture that you've got. And he basically is saying, so don't forget the law when you go over there. But then he opens up in verse 25. This is where we get some eschatology, some studies of the last things. So I'm just going to read through this because we really have to. He's doing a look forward now type thing. Here's an oracle about the future. So verse 25. When it says when you, is talking about something that's going to happen in the future. So when you become the father of children and children's children, and when you have remained long in the land and act corruptly, and when you make, so he's not saying if, he's saying when you make an idol in the form of anything. He just told him not to do that, but he's saying when you do it, because you're going to do it. I know you're going to go into the land, and you are going to make idols. And you are going to follow other gods. So when you make an idol in the form of anything, and do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. So he's calling a witness to this against the people, that you will surely perish quickly from the land. When you do these things, when you follow other gods, you will perish from the land where you are going over the Jordan to possess. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, among the other nations, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. There, once you've been scattered out from the land, and you've been scattered into the other nations, there in the other nations you will serve gods, the works of human hands, yada yada. But, out in these other nations, after you've been disobedient, after you've been scattered, but from there, you will seek the Lord. He's telling them what the future is going to be like. When you're out there, you will seek the Lord. You will seek the Lord with all, the Lord your God, and you will find him when you search for him. What? With all your heart and with all your soul. When you are in distress and all these things come upon you, when you've been scattered and all these things come upon you, in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. For the Lord your God is compassionate. He's a compassionate God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. So what happens here is this becomes the basis. This and another section in Deuteronomy 30, which we'll look at next week, this becomes the basis for what the prophets then say, this is what's going to happen in the latter days. Israel will continue to be disobedient until they are scattered. Well, this scattering happened finally, and it finally happened in the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, which we talked about. In 586 BC was when Babylon came in. And the nation of Israel, from Joshua and Judges into the kings, they were disobedient. And they kept being disobedient. They kept following other gods. And finally this happened. They were scattered. And so the prophets picked this up, and they're like, we were supposed to be a nation that followed God's ways and were a light to the nation, but we failed. And then they look back on this, and they see the oracles of Moses, and they say, but in the latter days, when we're scattered, and they kind of came back into the land and lived in the land, you know, like in Jesus' day, they were in the land for a period, not really that grand. They didn't have any kings, really. They kind of had they had King Herod, but he was kind of in league with Rome. They were never really back like they were in like David's time. But the prophets look back and they say, in the latter days, before the end of all things, before the Lord finally reestablishes us, we're going to be scattered, but we're going to call on the Lord while we're out there. And he's going to have compassion, and he's going to bring us back. And that becomes the basis for eschatology, that in the last days, there's going to be trouble and tribulation, but we're going to call on the name of the Lord, and he'll bring us back. So, yeah, this is the basis of it. But it all has to do with God disciplining his people one final time before the end time. We're going to talk about that probably a little bit more next week. But just this is like a foretaste of the end times. Is everything kind of clear as mud? Clearer than mud? Do what?
A little bit.
A little bit?
Just dirty water.
Dirty water? Okay. What part is maybe not so clear? Or is it not clear enough to even ask a question?
So, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' letter to the new nation going into the promised land, right?
Yes.
And then it involves eschatology in it, so prophesying and foreseeing of end times.
Yes, correct. And so basically it's, this was probably, well, I won't get into that, but yeah, so it's basically Moses giving, he knows, so he's looked back at their journey through Numbers, their rejection, wilderness wanderings, and now they're on the cusp of entering into the land. And he's telling them, you guys have been a stiff-necked people, and I know when you go in, you're going to follow other gods. And when you do that, this is what happens. You undergo the curse of the covenant, and the peak of the curse of the covenant is that they are scattered from their land out into the other nations. And let's just meditate on history for a second. Israel, 586 BC, they were scattered from their land. They were taken into Babylon, into Assyria in the 700s BC. And they were never really gathered back very great. I mean, they came back, but it wasn't that great. Well, then let's get back to Jesus' day. They rejected the Messiah. And in 70 AD, Rome destroyed the temple in 70 AD. Israel was scattered. And for 2,000 years, they were scattered. Israel, the nation, until 1948. They were regathered again. And we have a modern state of Israel. But this right here informs us of why all of that happened. It informs us of why Israel's back in the land. Why are they back in the land right now? Because God is being faithful to his covenant. But we've talked about this before. Right now, they're still, I mean, as great as Israel is and as much as we support them, they're still a stiff-necked people. They're still not following their Messiah, and they're not following nationally the law of God. And what happens? The covenant discipline comes on. And like, as not cool as that is to talk about, I mean, that's just what the scriptures tell us about reality. And so what we call the Great Tribulation is basically just the covenant disciplines happening again. Deuteronomy 28, which we'll look at next week. That's eschatology. But we know that after a period of discipline, Moses has told us, when they're out in the nations, they're going to say, let's return back to our Lord. Let's return back to God. God will have compassion, and he will regather them. So that's the expectation. And that's eschatology. I mean, that's in a nutshell. Now, I mean, that's not going to, you're not going to find that in a commentary very much, but you will find what I'm talking about, the basic structure of the covenant. That's just the covenant function. It's just that being mapped onto eschatology. It's just not the most popular thing, but it's very clear cut. You get into Revelation, and it has words all through it, from Deuteronomy, from the prophets, because it's just looking back and saying, this is what God's done, and this is what God continues to do. It's the pattern. So Moses is acting as a prophet to the nation there. Anybody else have any questions? Cool. All right. Let's keep going. The next section. So this is the, what is this, the B panel? Or no, the C. Well, I forgot to say, the first 3 chapters, they are just history, looking back on the book of Numbers and like their journey from Sinai up to this point where they're at. So that's what that section is. And like, guys, I am not doing justice to the book of Deuteronomy. It is like, it's so incredible of a book. Just the takes and perspective that Deuteronomy has on the predicament of Israel and each of the situations, it's phenomenal. So really recommend, like, meditate on the law of God. It's life-changing. So now we're getting into the section of recounting the covenant at Sinai. So next week, we're looking forward. Right now, Moses is now looking back. He's saying, let's go back and let's remember Mount Sinai, where you guys enter into covenant. So chapter 5. Chapter 5, he sets it up for chapter 6, but chapter 5 is, he tells, again, the 10 Commandments. So the 10 Commandments are the most, kind of the central words of the covenant. They're like kind of the most significant portion of it, but it's God's 10 words, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. And so that chapter just has that, and then the covenant exchange and agreement recounted. So basically he reminds them, your parents said yes to this covenant, and that includes you now. I know as moderns we don't think about like stuff that our parents does or did affecting us, but like nationally they've entered into a covenant, and you inherit the gods of your fathers and your mothers. It's just how it works. Okay, So he's saying, remember, we're in covenant. We're in covenant. And that sets us up for chapter 6. Okay, this is where we get some cool stuff. I think it's cool, at least. So chapter 6 is a chapter that has what's in it called the Shema. Everybody say Shema.
Shema.
Say Shema Israel.
Shema Israel.
Good job, guys. So the Shema is, I'll read what a friend of mine sent me. So it is Israel's central affirmation of faith. And this section, a particular portion of it, was recited 2 times daily by the devout people of Israel. So they're saying this, Shema Israel. I can't do the Hebrew. I used to could say it in Hebrew, but this is like the central affirmation in jump down to verse 4 is where it starts out. So Shema, it means hear or listen. So here we go. I'm going to just read it to us. Verse 4. Shema, O Israel. Hear, O Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Notice if this next part sounds familiar. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Where have you heard that before? Yeah. Jesus, what's the most important commandments? Well, it's the Shema, and it's Exodus, and it's Leviticus 19. Love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus, this is the central affirmation of their faith, and he says the Shema. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God is one. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. These words which I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk on the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as signs on your hands, and shall be as frontlets on your foreheads. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So this is the Shema. But this is a significant portion because it kind of it tells them, we could go into each of these words, but basically it's a holistic devotion to Yahweh. All of yourself, your resources, your physical energy, your mental, what is it? Just the things that you meditate on throughout the day. This is supposed to, your motivations, they all go upwards to Yahweh. And if you're doing that, then the rest of it just kind of will fall in place a lot easier. So this is the Shema. The rest of the chapter is basically passing this Torah on to the next generation. We teach our kids these things. We talk about them when we walk down the road, when we lie down, when we rise up. When you're just, my mother, this used to be her favorite chapter. She lived by it. When we walk along the way, when we go on prayer walks, we're going to talk about God. And so she based her parenting off of this chapter before she knew it was the Shema or anything. So yeah, very, very significant chapter. Don't have time to really go into all of it. But, chapter 7, we'll probably just kind of speed up at this point, but chapter 7 is it begins instructions about interactions with other nations. And again, all of this is within the context of remembering back to the Sinai covenant. So he's just kind of reminding them of things that they've already been instructed in. But if you remember the book of Numbers, they really messed up in their few examples of interacting with other nations. They were like, oh, other nations with other gods, let's just follow them. And so now there's going to be more nations, and we can't do that again. So he's remembering back to give instruction for the future. So instructions about interacting with other nations. As you read through chapter 7, you'll just see they're not supposed to, when they get into the land, you're not supposed to make covenants with the other nations. So Israel is not supposed to go into covenant with the people around them. They just did that in the Abraham Accord, and a peace treaty is happening right now. I don't want to comment on geopolitics or whether that's good or bad. It seems like good politics. But if I look at Torah, I'm I get uncomfortable. And so, I take this seriously. It informs our life and reality. Because these things, Israel is a nation again. And so Torah said, don't enter into covenant with the surrounding nations. But it just happened. And we know, actually, the book of Daniel says it's going to happen one final time before the end. So, just some things to keep in mind as you're looking out at the news and stuff.
Did that just happen?
It did. Yep, it did. It's called the Abraham Accord. All the Middle East is like, let's get in this thing. So, sort of, not quite that excited, but yeah. So don't make covenants. Also, don't intermarry with the other nations, because they're gonna, if you, again, talking about the sons, but if you marry your sons off to the daughters of these other nations, these will turn your sons away from Yahweh to following other gods. Sure enough, that happened, very much so. So don't intermarry between the nations. You are to stay within your nation. Also within it, chapter 7 is Israel is the Lord's possession. We already talked about that, but somebody read for me that verse, Deuteronomy 7, 6-8.
I can read it.
Go for it.
You are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor chose you because you were more in number than any of the peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he has sworn to your forefathers.
So why did God choose Israel for his own possession? Because they were really righteous, right? No, it wasn't because of that. But it was because of his love for the people, for Abraham, for Isaac, for Jacob, and for Israel. He has covenant faithfulness, covenant love on this nation. And so they have messed up, and they have gone after other gods. And God didn't choose them because, oh, this is a really righteous nation, or really abundant, or really strong. They weren't, but God still chose them. He chose this just messed up people to be a light to the nations and to be his chosen people. This is the character of our God, that he would choose to do something like that. The rest of the chapter is promises for abundance and victory over the other nations if they maintain covenant faithfulness in the land. So they're going in, and this is a little tough, but they're going to be going in and wiping out the other nations that are in the promised land. But this also just explained to us part of the reason why. We've talked about it, but he's saying, Israel, y'all aren't that righteous, and I'm not giving you this land because of your righteousness, but I'm actually giving you this land because of how wicked the other nations are. I don't think it's in this chapter, but the other nations are like burning their children in the fire to their gods, like child sacrifice. So like that's what's going on in the promised land, and this is God's land. This is his place, and he's like, the land will spew you out if you walk in these ways. And sure enough, so he's removing the nations that are there. All right, chapter 8. Chapter 8, it's cool because it gives a specific perspective on the wilderness wanderings. One of the things that it says is that the wilderness, while you were traveling around for 40 years in the wilderness with manna and stuff, the Lord was doing that to test you. It was a test. But let's open this up and let's just read a few verses here and see if anything stands out to you. I'll start reading in verse 1. All the commandments that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do them, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your forefathers. So again, if they want to keep the land, they have to walk in God's ways. So let's keep going. You shall remember all the ways that the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness for 40 years. So remember everything that he did. He did it that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments. He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. I'm going to start that verse over again. I'm just going to read the underlined parts in verse 3. You ready? He humbled you and let you be hungry, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. You heard that before?
Jesus said it to Satan
When did he say it?
when when Jesus went into the desert to fast?
He was in the wilderness wandering for 40 days. And he was hungry. And at the end of it, Satan said, turn this stone into bread. And Jesus said, no, I'm experiencing what Israel's experienced in the wilderness. I am being humbled by being allowed to be hungry. And I'm going to depend on the Lord. I'm going to depend on my Father. Because he is allowing me to understand that man does not live by bread alone, but lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. If you skip down to verse 5, Moses explains further, thus you are to know in your hearts that the Lord your God was disciplining you as a man disciplines his son. The Lord disciplined Israel in the wilderness as a man would discipline his son. Jesus went through that same thing as the son. So he just participated in what the Israelites went through in the wilderness. He had to go through it. But Israel failed. Did Jesus fail in his wilderness temptations? He didn't. He didn't. He walked the righteous path that Israel failed to. So this is, yeah. If you were to ask Jesus what his favorite book was, it would probably, I think it would be Deuteronomy. It might be Joshua because his name's on it, but Deuteronomy is pretty significant to Jesus. So, yeah, that's all we need to do in chapter 8. The rest of the chapter is warning against pride after entering the land. And so they get all this, like God's going to bless them in the land, and he says, but don't get prideful. And don't say it's because of our might or our strength that the Lord is blessing us with all these things. Chapter 9. Chapter 9, again, explains a little bit of the reasons for Yahweh giving them the land. And actually, really, we don't even have to hit this because we talked about all of this stuff. He's just basically telling them again, it's not because of your own righteousness, it's because of the wickedness of the nations. Remember the calf, the golden calf thing? You guys, Israel, are a stiff-necked people. So don't think that it's because of that. There is some good stuff in chapter 9, but we'll just kind of cruise through it. Chapter 10, the tablets were rewritten and placed in the ark. Another thing that happened in the ancient Near East was when people made covenants, they would take the law code, or their commandments, and they would take it into their temple and put it before the statue of their God. They would put it in the most significant place. And in this chapter, it's cool if you work through it. Moses is talking about when he made the tablets. He said, I wrote them down on the mountain, and then I went into the tabernacle and I stuck them in the Ark of the Covenant, like the most central place. So he's doing the same thing. He's putting the law code in front of the deity that they serve as a witness to what they're doing there. Same pattern. Same pattern. In this chapter, let me see, we get an interesting reference because it gets picked up again later on. It's the circumcision of the heart. And basically, after talking about creating the tablets and putting them, and the commandments and putting them before the Lord, he says that on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them. And he chose their descendants. So he's saying he chose your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even you, above all the peoples, as it is this day. So because he chose you, circumcise your hearts and stiffen your necks no longer. He's calling them to have a circumcised heart. Now you're like, well, why are you focusing on that so much? Without getting into too much, because I want to talk about it next week, we know later on that the prophets promise a day when God would circumcise the heart of Israel and would give them a new heart. Would give them a new heart where God's laws would be written on their heart. Well, that has its foundation back in Deuteronomy. Even those promises, they reflect back. They reflect back. So, but just want to trying to notice these things as we work through, so that when we get to them in a little bit later on, we're like, I know where that came from. This is in Deuteronomy. So, all right, let's hit chapter 11. Just talk about that real quick, and we'll have gotten through that section. Chapter 11 it reminds of the blessings for obedience. It also tells them don't follow other gods, but it tells them when they get into the land, not just don't follow gods, but go in and tear down the statues to the other gods. Go down and clear out the land because it's been defiled by the worship of these other divine beings. And again, that's more significant for us because we know that it's actual like living entities out there that are being worshipped. And God's like, no, I have my people and my land, and I'm jealous. He's a jealous God. And Israel has provoked God by acting wickedly and going after other gods. Again, to maintain, like I have to reiterate this, to maintain living in the land, you have to walk in faithfulness to the covenant. This pops up again in this chapter. Last thing I'll read, speaking of God's instructions and God's laws, he says this in Deuteronomy 11:20 through 21. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your sons may be multiplied in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens remain above the earth. So right here you see like the love for Torah that they're supposed to have. Write them on your doorpost. In other places, I don't think it put it here, like write them on your hand and as frontlets before your eyes. Like put this before you always. Teach it to your children. This is your life. This becomes your way of existing, because I want to use you to influence all the nations around you. Because your job, Israel, is to show the rest of the people the ways of Yahweh. Disciple the nations into his ways. And if you succeed in that, then the nations will begin to walk in the ways of Yahweh. But they failed in it, and so they needed somebody to come along later. And that's in the future. But yeah, so that's the section on the Sinai covenant, and basically just kind of reestablishing that for the new generation before they enter in. We do have like 5 more minutes, so I want to get through as many of these chapters as I can of the laws, because they're significant. Like they're different, and we need to know them. But I'll pause here for any quick questions. If we don't get to them, that's okay.
I just have a quick one.
Yeah.
When it talks about circumcising your heart, does it mean basically like soften your heart?
Yeah. So it would be
confused by the complaint.
like you have to like talk about what circumcision kind of
Just like tearing apart.
stands for. But basically, it's a softening of your heart to walk in the ways of the Lord, and to basically it's kind of like a dedicate yourself fully to the Lord. So like what circumcision became is it became like a marker for like we are setting ourselves apart as a particular people unto Yahweh. So if you're circumcising your heart, you're cutting away the dead, the old, and you're giving your entire devotion and allegiance unto Yahweh. Like it's a distinct marker that I'm being set apart to be in this covenant. And so it's basically saying faithfulness to the covenant at a heart level. I think maybe that's a way to put it. Yeah, it's an interesting way of saying it, of course, but it's picked up all through. Like, yeah. So I'll be better prepared to answer that next week. So, anybody else? Cool. Let's just maybe get through one more chapter. I do want to hit as many of these as we can. Chapter 12, you see I put centralizing of cult. So that's more for me, just so I know what chapter we're on. But the term cult, it can be like a pagan cult, so like bad stuff. But technical term for cult is just like temple functioning. So like Yahweh has temple functioning. He has a priesthood. There's sacrifice made to him. That's the word for cult. But basically this is just a description of how the Levites are going to be operating in the tabernacle. Now we've already talked about that. So what's the difference? Well, Deuteronomy picks it up, and it makes it different because when they get in the land, it's going to be different. when they get into the land, Yahweh is going to choose a particular place to place his name at that particular place. So the place that Yahweh chooses for his name, that is now where the tabernacle and later temple will be set up. And all sacrificing is now only going to be done at that location. Prior to this point, there's not really stipulations about, like, if you wanted to sacrifice to Yahweh, as long as you did it properly in this city or that city, that's okay. Well, now it changes. He's gonna choose a place. He's gonna choose a place. It says, let me get the wording right. Actually, lost my place. Yeah. Sorry. So he chooses a place, a location to place his name there. It's like, I forget the exact phrase of it, but it's really significant that, like, this is where I will choose to set my name up. And you're not allowed to worship me with sacrifice any other place than that. That would be like, though, saying everybody, all the pastors everywhere, can no longer preach and, like, give communion anywhere except at Trinity in Burlington. So if you're going to do a sacrifice, or you guys are going to meet for preaching and giving out communion, you have to make your way to Burlington, North Carolina, and you only worship God here, that nowhere else in the United States. And it's like, so God is making a very significant thing, because what he's wanting to do is he's wanting to choose a central location that becomes the most significant for the worship of Yahweh. Now later on, that location is going to become Jerusalem. Okay? That's where the temple gets set up. And we know also later on, that's where Jesus will reign from. That's the place that he has chosen to place his name. Sacrifices will now be done there. Makes sense? So that's the change. So Deuteronomy 12:5, you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes. Okay, here it is. To establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. So the other nations also, in this chapter we see other nations have ways of worshiping their gods, and Israel is instructed in this chapter also not to worship Yahweh the way that the other nations worship their gods. So this is Deuteronomy 12:31. The other nations, they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. So, like, part of their role is to show, no, this is how the one true God wants to be worshipped. And this has a practical implication for us today, because there's a lot of talk about, like, redeeming New Age stuff, or redeeming, like, cult practice to, like, use that to worship Yahweh. No, we don't redeem those things. We don't see, oh, these people are doing this thing, and maybe it's a little off, but we can use that to worship Yahweh. That's not okay. Like, God has never been okay with that. There's one way to follow the Lord, and he's laid it out, and we want to do it that way. So that's a significant part in this chapter. But and it's 2 o'clock, so we got as far as we could get. But next week we'll just pick back up. I'll try and cruise through these, and we'll wrap it up. But that's Deuteronomy. Any questions on the stuff we covered?
So the Israelites basically, like, I guess I've never thought of it before, but they didn't, like, move. Like, if one tribe went, they all went, or, they all stick together, because that's such an uncommon concept now today. To say that they all worshipped in the same place. Well, what if one of them moved, and then, but they all, was that kind of thing, they all stayed together?
No,
always?
so good question. So later on, that God actually makes, we didn't get to it because it's in chapter 16, where it talks about the feast times. So there's the feasts of, like, Passover, Feast of Booths, I think, different feasts. And during the feasts, they would actually have to make pilgrimage to that location. But just during, like, the normal day-to-day life, if they're out, live in a city so far away, you only had to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year if you're physically able. So outside of that, though, the priests are doing their sacrificing in the temples. But outside of that, later on, as they're spread out, then they just like wouldn't come. I forget how like the day-to-day sacrificing would work, but they just like wouldn't bring a sacrifice to the temple except like on those feast days, I think. So things changed as they spread out more. So like right now, when they first get into the land, they're not even, we already talked about it, but they're not even supposed to like sacrifice their bull or sheep to have dinner with it. They can't even do that away from the temple. Except God says, but if you live really far away and it's too far away, you can just go ahead and sacrifice it in your city. So he's
So
just,
they were allowed to.
they were allowed to,
Okay.
yeah, definitely.
So it
they
wasn't
were.
like a rule, they all had to stay in
No.
one spot.
No. Yeah, so as they multiplied, they would spread out, because the land is, the original land borders are pretty big. They never fully got to the full extent of those land borders, not yet, but it's pretty big. So yeah, good question. So Deuteronomy is the foundation for, it's the prototype for the prophets. It's the preparation for eschatology. It explains human history and why God, we talked about God is sovereign in human history. It's all around what the type stuff that he's talking about in the book of Deuteronomy. So